Hello, everyone. I'm Robert Watson, and welcome back to college. Every year I teach a freshman class in addition to all my other classes, and I give my freshmen a little getting to know you quiz. And this is what we learned this past academic year. Not a single one of my freshmen has ever dialed a phone, a rotary phone. Not a single one has ever turned a channel on a television. Not a single one has ever rolled down a car window. None of them have an alarm clock. No one has ever used a typewriter. Most have never seen a typewriter. No one's ever used a payphone. No one has a stopwatch. No one's heard of a Rolodex. No one has ever used a fax, and a few said, "What's a fax?" Terms like Walkman or rewind have no meaning to them, and they lived in a day and age, of course, before bottled water and darn near before books now, right? So welcome back to college. It's a radically different world. So I have the pleasure today of talking with you about rating the presidents. We'll go through the list. And about every 3 years, there's a different presidential ranking poll. And a number of organizations participate in these polls, hosting them. C-SPAN, the White House Historical Association, the Siena Research Institute in New York. And I've had the great pleasure of being one of the historians that participates in these rankings. I think I've done 6 of the last 7. So I'll give you the inside scoop. And I encourage all of you to put together your rankings. Who do you think are the greats and the cellar dwellers, okay? So let's get to it. So first off, a composite on the presidents. A joke I used to use before Barack Obama was president. When people would say, who's the next president going to be? What I would say is this: about two-thirds of the presidents have virtually the same composite. So I would say the next president will be a man. He'll be about 6 foot tall. He'll have blue eyes. He'll be of Scottish descent. He'll be a lawyer, educated at an Ivy League school. He'll be from one of 4 states: New York, Ohio, Massachusetts, or Virginia. He'll be a dog lover. He'll be a mama's boy. He'll have 2 kids who don't turn out so well. His wife, he will marry up. His wife will come from more money than him. And that's basically the presidents in a composite. So we've had, as you can see on my screen here, we've had lawyers, most of them, as I said. We've had some generals, right? Washington and Jackson and Grant and Ike. And we've had a few educators. Woodrow Wilson, for example, was a professor and president of Princeton. Garfield, a president and a professor also. We had a famous engineer, that would be Herbert Hoover. And we even had an actor and a realtor or a developer. So we've had 2 father and son combos. Of course, the Adams family. We had John, our 2nd, and John Quincy, our 6th president. And they both just served 1 term, interestingly enough. Then, of course, we had the Bushes, 41 and 43, H.W. and W. We had a grandfather and grandson combo. William Henry Harrison was the grandfather of Benjamin Harrison, both serving in the 19th century. 5 of the first 7 presidents owned slaves. The only 2 that didn't were the 2 Adams presidents. The first 6 were either from Virginia or Massachusetts. So Washington, Virginia, Adams, Massachusetts, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Virginia again, another Adams, Massachusetts. In the 19th century, we tended to use nicknames, old or ol, as a nickname, like Old Man Eloquent was John Quincy Adams. Old Hickory was Andrew Jackson. Old Rough and Ready was Zachary Taylor. Old Tippecanoe was William Henry Harrison. So we had all those old nicknames. In the 20th century, we switched to initials, non-presidents like RFK and MLK. Of course, famously, we had FDR and JFK and LBJ. And DJT, right? So, well, the presidents, so we've had all sorts in terms of height and weight. The tallest president was Abraham Lincoln. He was 6'4", which would be like being 7 foot today. And we've had a lot of presidents over 6 foot. Monroe, FDR, Reagan, Obama, Bill Clinton, Lyndon Johnson, Trump, They're all over 6 foot. I think Trump said he's what, 6'8", 6'9", something like that. Um, Heavy and light. The heaviest president was Taft. Triple trays, 333. And the story about him getting stuck in his tub is actually true. At one museum during a nationwide tour, I actually was speaking during the tour of all this presidential memorabilia, and they had Taft's tub. And I'm 6'2", about 230, and I could have gone swimming in that tub. So it was a big tub. He was a big fella. The smallest president, shortest president, was James Madison. They called him the Great Little Madison. Dolly called him Darling Little Jemmy. I'm sure he said, Dolly, come on, I'm the president. Another name. Madison was about 5'4", weighed about a buck, weighed about 100 pounds. Albert Gallatin, the former Secretary of the Treasury, used to have a great line. Of course, Madison was brilliant. He would say, so much mind, so little matter. Some had a lot to say, others very little to say. Teddy Roosevelt wouldn't shut up. He was nonstop. He would give fantastic speeches, in a day and age without the kind of microphones that we have today, and just roar like a lion for an hour or two. Teddy Roosevelt is a great story where he was, a group of dignitaries were coming to meet him, including some that were very critical of him. So the staff knew there was going to be some fireworks. And when these dignitaries, after about an hour, opened up the door and walked out of his office, they looked shell-shocked. And one of the aides said to them, "What did you say?" And they said, "We said hello." Teddy Roosevelt railed for the next 59 minutes. Coolidge, Calvin Coolidge, known as Silent Cow or Quiet Cow, had very, very little to say. He rarely said more than 2 words, no comment. There was a fun story about the press trying to trick him into a press conference and saying more than 2 words, although he was privy to this inside joke and bet, if you will. So when he met them, he just said, "You lose." Tragically, 4 were assassinated: Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, and John Kennedy. 4 died in office of natural causes: William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor, Harding had a heart attack in 1923, and FDR, of course, a cerebral hemorrhage on April 12, 1945 at his Warm Springs resort. 3 were impeached, including the recent president. Impeached but not removed. Remember, impeachment's a 2-step process. Impeached by the House, then removed by the Senate, but still technically impeached. And 1, of course, Nixon, resigned. Presidents have had a variety of views on the office. George Washington once said, "I had feelings not unlike a culprit going to a place of execution." Wow. Thomas Jefferson called it a splendid misery. Andrew Jackson was the one who called it dignified slavery. James K. Polk said the presidency is no bed of roses. My personal hero, Harry Truman, called it the Great White Jail, and said being president is like riding a tiger. You hang on for life. If you let go, you get eaten up and swallowed by it. Another quote: "This is more work than in my previous life. I thought it would be easier." That was Donald Trump. So by my accounting, about half the presidents seem to have really liked being president, and about half did not like being president or found it a bit too much. Here's a few more of these similar kind of quotes. "I am fairly out and you are fairly in. See which of us is the happiest." That was Washington to John Adams. So even Washington found it a bit much. Another one: "If you are as happy, my dear sir, on entering this house as I am on leaving it and returning home, you're the happiest man in the country." That was our 15th president, James Buchanan, on the handoff to Abraham Lincoln. "The president is a glorified public relations man who spends all of his time pushing and kicking people to do what they should already be doing." That was Harry Truman, who also said that poor Ike is going to come in here, and he's used to being the Supreme Allied Commander, and he'll say, "Do this and do that," and nothing will get done. You have to massage, cajole, twist arms, beg, grovel. Last one I have up here: "My God, this is a hell of a job. I have no trouble with my enemies, but my damn friends, They're the ones that keep me walking the floors at night. That was Warren Harding from Ohio, who served from 21 to 23. And he said that for good reason. The Ohio gang, right? One of the most corrupt presidencies in history, with the Teapot Dome scandal and some other things. So let's get into the ranking. Why rank the presidents? Americans seem to, we love to rank everything, don't we? NCAA top 25. We rank movies, the sweeps, the Fortune 500. We have a predisposition, it seems, for ranking or rating everything. So it would seem natural that sooner or later we would get around to ranking the presidents. Is it worth it? I think so. Is it 100% accurate? I think not. But I do think it's worthwhile to periodically pause, reflect, and get a sense of what it is we look for in our greats and what lessons from our not so greats. So we've been ranking the presidents since 1948. The first poll was by a fellow named Arthur Schlesinger from Harvard, if anybody knows that name. And he corralled 37, 38, 39 of the nation's leading historians and had them put the presidents in categories like great, near great, above average, yada, 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 failure. Then he averaged out the results and released it. And the country just loved the poll. He did a second one in 1962, same methodology. And this is what really put the enterprise on the map. In 1962, the president was Kennedy. And Arthur Schlesinger's son, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, was Kennedy's close friend and confidant. So Kennedy, being something of a closeted historian, told Schlesinger Jr., as soon as your dad's poll comes out, I want to know the results. Interrupt my meeting immediately. So sure enough, Schlesinger Jr. and I had interviewed him about this before his passing for an academic journal I used to edit. And he said that when he announced the results, he said Kennedy danced around the room like a kid on his birthday. Why? Because Kennedy did not care for Ike and Ike didn't care for Kennedy. And Ike was ranked rather middling in that early poll. But everybody in the room then commented to everyone they knew about Kennedy's reaction, and it kind of made the press and put the poll on the map. Now, today, about every 3 years, we take a poll. What you're looking at now are some of the questions that are asked. Should we use a more holistic poll? So as you rank your top 10 and your bottom 10, think of this. Should we just overall, who were the greatest, who were the worst? Or should we use, a mechanistic kind of approach? In other words, we look at specific things like, and I put 5 of about 25 that they use, the quality of their appointments, cabinet, court, so forth and so on, bills, treaties, and executive orders, the state of the economy, their approval and popularity, regime. So, for example, if we look at these, there have been some really great appointments made throughout history and some really bad appointments made throughout history. Truman's selection of General George Marshall, that's a no-brainer. George Washington's selection of both Jefferson and Hamilton, no-brainer. The current president's appointments, even if you're a supporter, to be honest, you got to question their competence and their credentials for that. Some presidents have had great cabinets, others not so much. I think Reagan had a pretty good cabinet in terms of quality and experience. I think Carter, not so much in experience. Bills, treaties, and executive orders. If you look at, let's say, basically the Emancipation Proclamation amounted to an executive order, that will stand the test of time. Truman desegregated the military with Executive Order 9981. That'll stand the test of time and set the groundwork for the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Some treaties and some bills, LBJ with Medicare or the 65 Voting Rights Act, I think those will stand the test of time. Conversely, with Trump backing out of the Paris Climate Accord, Singapore agreements to keep control of North Korea, various nuclear deterrence and the nuclear non-proliferation treaties, the TPP, the Iran nuclear deal, the UN Human Rights Council, UNESCO, and getting out of countless important treaties that had bipartisan support, that will probably be an indictment. State of the economy, George W. Bush will always be, I think, indicted for that, for taking the world's largest budget surplus handed off by Bill Clinton and turning it into the world's largest budget deficit in about a year and a half. And then turning over a massive deficit. Obama, I think, will get some props in history because he inherited an economy in free fall and turned it into 7 years of straight growth. Took the unemployment numbers from double digits down to 4% or so, and reduced the budget deficit by about 2/3. Trump had a very strong economy for much of his presidency, and that he will probably get credit for that. Some presidents have been reelected, and that will always factor in. Others not. So Bush 1 and Carter, for example, one-termers, that will work against them. Regime. What a regime is when you leave office, does your legacy last beyond you? So if you think of someone like FDR, who created a domestic policy regime, or Harry Truman with internationally, multilateralism, internationalism, the kind of organizations like NATO. Truman's foreign policy regime was followed by every single president of both political parties, Ike all the way through until Trump. So every president, for decades, except the current president, followed this. So that's quite a regime. So those are some of the things that you can look at mechanically. Another list is, do we look at traits and duties? And you can look at the list I have up here. Are they a great orator? Can they communicate their message? You think of Bush 1 when saying, I'm not very good with the vision thing. Well, goodness gracious, you're the president. You better have a vision for where you're headed. Bill Clinton was brilliant, but he was not a very good manager. He was chronically late and not a very good organizer. Legislative leadership. Lyndon Johnson might not have been very ethical, which will work against him, but he was a legislative vote wrangler among the best we've ever had. So that will probably work for him. So when I rank and talk to my colleagues, I always advocate that we use 3 criteria. So, and you're free to borrow these, by the way, for your polls. So here's what I argue with my colleagues. Number 1, is the nation stronger on when the day they leave office than the day they entered office? I focus on the big ticket items. 100 years from now, nobody's going to remember some small executive orders or a small appointment. They're going to remember the big ticket items. Number 2, is the office of the presidency stronger, more respected, in better shape on the day you leave office than the day you entered office? And number 3, did you rise to extraordinary heights during extraordinary challenges? 3 of my favorites, Truman, Lincoln, and Washington, were uneducated, rather common folks, but my goodness, did they put wings on and soar and rise to extraordinary heights. Overachievers, one might say. On the other hand, Bill Clinton, for all of his legislative gifts, and he had a reasonably impressive record, I do think he underachieved. So those are the 3 criteria that I tend to use. So there's been some critiques and controversies of these ranking polls. One is some conservative groups, the ISI, Wall Street Journal, the Federalist Society frequently makes this argument, saying that the polls are partisan, that all professors are somehow liberal and whatnot. Well, they tend to get the professors who have written a lot of books on the presidency, who are cited in the literature, who are seen by their peers as the leading experts. So I disagree with the partisanship argument. If you look at some of your great biographers and historians, your Gordon Woods, your Joseph Ellis's, Doris Kearns Goodwin, John Meekum, David McCullough, these folks, I think, transcend partisanship. I know that I take my personal political hat off and put on my nerdy academic historian hat on when I rank these. I'm a registered Democrat, but during my time as a rater, I have argued and called friends and colleagues who are doing this to try to bring Ford up, a Republican. I think Ford was right, for example, to pardon Nixon. And I don't think Ford was a below average. I wouldn't have put him above average. I think he was an average president. I've also argued to bring Grant up, a Republican. I think Grant got a bad rap in history. I think he was a much better leader than people realize. And I've always, thirdly, argued for Nixon. I don't think Nixon was a failure. Watergate will always be the opening line of his biography for 1,000 years. And of course, that's an indictment. And Nixon had a diabolical personality. One biographer described him as plotting and scheming, and he was. But with every passing year, Nixon's work on détente, opening up China and nuclear nonproliferation with the Soviet Union, I think those things look better with every passing year, and Nixon should be brought up as a result. And he has been, not because of me. Also, domestically, Nixon was no ideologue. For example, Jimmy Carter and George W. Bush often had binders on ideologically, and they saw everything through a very narrow ideological perspective. No, Nixon was a pragmatist. Think about it. The Consumer Product Safety Commission, the EPA, a lot of these measures Nixon did not support. Some clean air, clean water legislation, but he signed them into law because the Democrats had the Congress. They were popular. The country wanted it. He was very much a pragmatist. The number of raters. So there's two views here. About half the polls have just a few dozen, like I said, 39, whatever. And they picked some of the leading scholars. Some other polls will get 1, 2, 300. They'll survey a broader scale of professors. I'm not sure which one's right or which one's wrong. I would argue for less, however. I think that you try to get the people who have written the most books and are cited the most on this. Just because you're a professor or a historian doesn't mean you know all the presidents or all about the presidents. There's another question. Should we rank William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor, and Garfield? All three died very soon into their terms. William Henry Harrison, only a month into his presidency, old Tippecanoe for the battle, Tippecanoe Creek, during the War of 1812. He was sort of the first public relations campaign, you might say. And they said that this guy's, as tough as Andrew Jackson, the size of George Washington. He allegedly killed Tecumseh with his bare hands. No, he didn't. Tecumseh looked like The Rock. William Henry Harrison was an old guy who probably looked like Bernie Sanders. So when William Henry Harrison showed up in 1841 for his inauguration, people had buyer's remorse. There was this little old frail guy. So even though it was a bitterly cold day for his inaugural, he didn't wear his gloves, his scarf, his jacket to try to show everybody that he wasn't too old and frail. Of course, he caught pneumonia and died a month later. So I don't call him old Tippecanoe. I call him old natural selection. When to rate is the next item I had. So some folks say a good 14 years, maybe 20 years have to pass. At the bottom of the screen, you see I wrote the 1978 PRA. That's the Presidential Records Act. So what it is when a president leaves office, the National Archives goes through all their papers and records to make sure there aren't any state secrets that are going to be released. It often takes about 14 years. So really, scholars have not had an opportunity to comb through the records. So we really shouldn't rank, I think, until at least 14 years. I usually, and other folks usually say 20. Because after 14 years, then scholars start to produce the books, the journal articles, have the conversations and debates. And that takes a couple years for all those books and articles to come out. And we don't want to rate based on just one quick look at the record or maybe one book or two articles. We want a library of information. Plus, Harry Truman used to always say it takes 20 years before you can get an assessment of the president. So maybe 20. There's movement over time. We've seen Nixon and Grant coming up a little bit. We've seen Kennedy and LBJ falling a little bit. Wilson and Andrew Jackson have fallen a lot. Ike's come up a bit. Reagan's come up a bit. So there's movement over time. History is hindsight's 2020 as we get more information on presidents. And for example, Truman was considered almost a failure when he left office. But today, those difficult decisions on the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift, firing MacArthur, which was unpopular at the time, yet everyone agrees it was the right thing to do today. Civil rights, statehood for Israel, massive loan guarantee for the fledgling state of Israel. Truman brought in over 390,000 refugees from the displaced persons camps from the Holocaust. That was enormously unpopular at the time. We all celebrate that today. There's overrated and underrated presidents. There was a question about Reagan and Bush one for a while, because when W came into office by executive order, he sealed some of the papers for Reagan and Bush one. So historians did not have access to it. A number of lawsuits tried to pry those open. Then when his successor came into office, they opened up the paperwork. So it took us a little longer to get assessment of Reagan and Bush one. So here's the first poll, that 1948 Schlesinger poll. There's the greats. You can see them: Lincoln, Washington, FDR, Wilson, Jefferson, Jackson. I'm in somewhat agreement with this, although not Jackson. There's your near greats, and I won't insult you by reading them. There's your average. Let's take a look at where we go from here. There's your failures, Grant and Harding. I would clearly agree with Warren Harding. Corrupt, not very smart, womanizer. But Grant, I think, got a bad rap here. And Grant has come up. Buchanan, if you look at below average, I always used to list Buchanan as the worst president. He lost the Union and did virtually nothing to try to prevent that. I think that the last position will change here in a couple of years. But so here's the next poll. This is the Schlesinger Jr. poll. I've cut out a lot of polls. This was a 1996 poll. So the family business was passed to Arthur Schlesinger Jr., and this also was a pretty famous poll. Now you can see the greats were just down to three, Lincoln, Washington, and FDR. Near greats, I was happy to see Truman finally get into that near great. Teddy Roosevelt, and I think we'd all agree with that. James K. Polk, there's a surprise for you, only served one term in the 1840s. Could have had a second term, but stepped down after just one term. He would die just a couple of months later, by the way. Polk was president during the what is called today the Mexican-American War. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo added basically the Southwest. So he was an expansionist, a manifest destiny, imperialist kind of president. Some people like that, others don't, but Polk. Let's go down and look at the rest of the list. What's interesting is if you look at low average, a lot of our recent presidents in 96 were considered low average. Clinton, Bush 1, Reagan, Carter, Ford, they were all huddled together right there at lower than average, low average, almost in the below average category. Failures, we have several now. Notice Nixon's there. Hoover, I think you can make an argument. Unfortunately, Grant's still there. Pierce for sure. Andrew Johnson for sure. And Harding and Buchanan are perpetual bottom feeders. Here's the C-SPAN survey. This is 2000. This is probably the most cited survey. People always talk about this. So I just put, in the sake of brevity, your top 10 and your bottom 10 there. I'm pretty much in agreement with the top 10. This looks a lot like my top 10 when I submit my rankings. I will say that I switched 4 and 5 and now put Harry at 4 and Teddy Roosevelt at 5. But you know, I'm not a Wilson fan. I dropped him down a little bit. There's your bottom, and the bottom looks something like my bottom 10, except for Grant. And I don't think we should rank William Henry Harrison, as I said earlier. Only served a month and spent that month on his back in bed. So how do we get an assessment of him? But Buchanan, you can see, is last, and Andrew Johnson, Harding, and Pierce. Those four are almost always in your bottom 5. Scholars are widely in agreement on pretty much your top 10 and your bottom 10, with the exception of Grant coming up now. Okay, so what lessons do we have here from these folks? The greats. Okay, so here's 5 of the folks that always make the list. Let's start with George. Washington, I think, is the definition of honor. Washington always talked about, he was concerned, for example, he favored impeachment. Washington was concerned about conduct unbecoming of a leader. Washington felt that public service was the highest honor. And he's the definition of honor, a man of great, great integrity. You know, Washington is famous for what he didn't do. And that was that he didn't continue in the office. He stepped down. And of course, after the Revolutionary War and during his presidency, he stepped down not once, but twice, leading King George III, his opponent. After Washington stepped down from the war, he said, Washington has done what no man has ever done in history, voluntarily given up power, and he's the greatest man of our times. After Washington did it a second time, George III amended that and said he's the greatest man of all times. Of course, George III wasn't much of an historian. The great Cincinnatus had stepped down, which was, by the way, Washington's hero. What's amazing about Washington is when the framers were discussing the presidency, which would become Article 2 of the Constitution, they didn't really know what they wanted to do. They knew that they wanted to limit powers. Think about it. Every power the president has is limited, divided, checked to some extent. President can appoint, but the Senate confirms. President can sign a treaty, Senate has to ratify. President can veto, Congress can override. But what they did is they all knew who the first president would be. Washington. And they knew that Washington, through his every action and inaction, would carve out precedents greater than they in their impressive collective wisdom could design. And I'll be darned if he didn't do it. So much of what we see today, virtually every president except Trump has followed to the letter of the law the Washington precedents. You know, the way we hire, the way we fire our cabinet, advise and consent when a president goes to the Senate. They don't physically go. A lot of these precedents were not discussed in the Constitution. Washington, we just follow his precedent. It's what he did. He also appointed a great cabinet. And even though he was a federalist, not an anti-federalist, he didn't talk about it. He wanted to be the president of all the people. All presidents should seek to be the president of all Americans, not just those who voted for him or not just a narrow base. Lincoln, of course, the definition of humility and magnanimity. Think of Lincoln at the end of the war, for crying out loud. Lincoln wants to forgive the South. You know, both sides drew the sword, quote unquote. Rather than rub it in, Lincoln is great about his magnanimity. Lincoln tells Grant and Joshua Chamberlain and those at Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, you know, don't celebrate. Let Lee down easy. He did not want to see him dragged around in chains. And indeed, Lee goes back home and says, you know, we lost, and then encourages folks to follow the Union. You know, Joshua Chamberlain, on Lincoln's orders, even has the Union band play Dixie as the Confederates surrender. Reconstruction, which Lincoln was the original architect of, was very magnanimous in terms of funding and rebuilding the South in order to bring them back into the fold. Lincoln had a great sense of humor and wit. You know, it's the great line with Stephen Douglas, Judge Douglas, Lincoln-Douglas debates. Lincoln used to always joke about how unattractive he was. He would tell audiences, now that I'm on stage, I can finally see all of you, and you can finally see me. And I'm certain we'd all agree that I have the better end of the bargain. You know, cute things like that. He once says to Judge Douglas, when Douglas accuses Lincoln of being a two-faced liar, Lincoln says, Judge, if I was two-faced, would I wear this one? So a great wit, a great humility. The Emancipation Proclamation was genius. Think about it, January 1, 1863. Lincoln wanted to emancipate earlier. He pushes for emancipation in the federal district, April of 62. He originally comes up with this early in 62, but he has to wait until we have a victory. The North was losing. Think about it. If he emancipates while the North is losing, at best, it would look empty. At worst, it would look desperate. A lot of Northerners said this war is not about ending slavery, it's about keeping the Union together. Would Northerners send their sons to die to end slavery? Not sure. The Constitution. There were questions of whether or not it was even constitutional to end slavery. Buchanan used to say, no, I don't have the power to do so. Judge Douglas would hold up a copy of the Constitution and say, Mr. Lincoln, show me where it says that you can do this. Lincoln would come back and hold it up and say, show me where it says I can't, right? So he would flip it. So by waiting, Lincoln waited until the Union at Antietam had what he could declare a victory. He only emancipates slaves in southern states that are in open rebellion. Therefore, the border states can keep slavery. He doesn't want to drive them into the Confederate fold, right? Because he knows when the war ends, it will end everywhere. And by saying that I'm doing this only in states in open rebellion, he found an end around the Constitution. The Article 2 makes the president the commander-in-chief. Therefore, he said, I'm only emancipating for military purposes because slaves produce food, clothing, and weaponry for the South. So Lincoln found a way of brilliantly balancing everything. The timing was perfect, remarkable. Harry Truman up there, my hero. Think about the Marshall Plan, which really saved Western civilization. And he even has the humility to name it after General Marshall. This country was in no mood for spending that kind of money to rebuild Germany, rebuild Europe. The Berlin airlift, you know, the Defense Department wants to charge in, you know, gassing up the tanks. The State Department says, you know, we'll give up Berlin when the Soviets blockaded it by water, by rail, by road. Truman says neither one's acceptable. He finds the 50-yard line and we fly in supplies and use it as a great public relations victory. The Soviets are willing to starve and kill a city, and look what we're willing to do to save lives. NATO, his transatlantic alliance was brilliant. Um, as I said a moment ago, statehood for Israel and massive Jewish immigration after the Holocaust. Think about it today. You know, Americans are great people, but my God, do we have an anti-immigrant, knee-jerk kind of gene among us. Truman fought tooth and nail to do what was right. And probably the last politician to say, I'd rather do what's right and lose than do what's wrong and win. FDR, think of the genius of the Lend-Lease program. How can we aid Britain without getting into the big fight? The arsenal of democracy. Talk about a wordsmith. What a great expression. You know, I think the parallel to today, where we can't even make enough masks and make sure that all first responders, essential personnel have enough PPE, or schools. My gosh, we want to open up schools and disinfectant masks, rooms, staff, training. The schools have nothing that they need to reopen. Think about during World War II, the supply lines and chains, the arsenal of democracy, tanks and guns and food and fuel. Our soldiers across the planet had what they needed. That just remarkable. And his fireside chats, a little over 36 fireside chats. What a way of directly talking to the people. And FDR knew that the people didn't want to hear an economics lecture on interest rates. Rather, he would tell them it's going to be okay. You know, I'm the captain of this ship of state, and there's stormy seas ahead, but we'll find a safe harbor. It's going to be okay. When FDR said it's going to be okay, it was going to be okay. And Teddy Roosevelt, the great bull moose, his domestic agenda, remarkable. He fought for universal health care, fought for women getting the right to vote, really a father of conservation and national parks, a standardized work week, food safety laws after the publication of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, child labor laws, remarkable. First American to win the Nobel Peace Prize for the negotiation of the end of the Russo-Japanese conflict. Teddy Roosevelt, extraordinary, father of our great Navy in some ways. And of course, the Bull Moose, the nickname the Bull Moose. He's campaigning in Wisconsin, gets shot in the chest, refuses medical attention, insists on giving his speech. And he gets up and, people are ready for this great roar. And he gets up and he says softly, "You'll have to excuse me. I don't know if you've heard or not, but I've just been shot in the chest." Wow. Talk about an attention getter. And then he stumbles a little, but then rises up and delivers maybe the greatest line in presidential history, quote unquote, "Of course, it's going to take more than a single bullet to bring down a bull moose." How do you not vote for that guy? So there's some of the greats. What not to do. Here's some of the bottom feeders. That's Buchanan on the top left. Buchanan in his memoirs, and I don't recommend them to you, probably the worst read I've ever read. Mr. Buchanan's Administration on the Eve of Rebellion, that was the title. He basically says, I ask that history not judge me too harshly. Guess what? We have. So Buchanan was known as a doughface, northerner. He's from Pennsylvania, Lancaster, who was basically pro-South. That's Andrew Johnson, bottom left, one of only 3 presidents to be impeached in 1868. Johnson, as I said, was thin-skinned, took things personally, not very bright, an alcoholic. In fact, it's believed that he came to the inauguration, Lincoln's second, drunk, and Lincoln ordered his aides to escort Johnson out. Why did he pick him? Lincoln wanted a Southerner on the ticket symbolically, and Southerners didn't want to join Lincoln. And Johnson was from a part of Tennessee, it's sort of a donut hole in Tennessee that was pro-union. That's Warren Harding on the bottom right. The Teapot Dome remains one of the worst scandals. Harding was a drinker, a womanizer, fathered a child with a woman named Nan Britton out of wedlock while he was president. Harding, not very bright, one of the worst cabinets. It's hard to say much good at all about him. They said he looked like Caesar. I don't know about that. And that's Franklin Pierce, top right. Pierce was president in the 1850s from New Hampshire. Pierce, I think, of this group, had the potential to be a good president. He was something of a dandy, a good member of Congress, very popular, a good speaker, reasonably intelligent. But what happened, he had a great tragedy. The Pierces, he and his wife, Jane Appleton Means Pierce, had 3 kids, all of them boys. 2 die in infancy. And Jane blames Franklin for their deaths. And it begins to get to him. He begins to believe this. Jane is just a dour, ultra religious person, spends her whole time in her room reading scripture and doesn't, leave, she thinks dancing's a sin, singing's a sin, unless if it's glorifying God. So they have 1 child remaining, Benjamin. Jane begs Franklin to get out of office in the name of the 3rd remaining child. Benjamin's 11, 13 range. Pierce leaves Congress at the height of his power, which shocks people. But back in New Hampshire, he announces that he will pursue the presidency. Jane would later write that she only found out he was president. She never even knew he was running. She only found out when he became president. How could this be? Well, back then they really didn't run. Remember, I said Jane never left her room, didn't read the newspaper. And of course, it's New Hampshire. It's a little slow socially. Beautiful state. So they go to Massachusetts. Pierce is trying to, lift Jane up. They go to Massachusetts, then they head to the inaugural, and it's snowing, and Benjamin's with them. I think he's now 13. The train derails, killing 1 passenger, Benjamin. So Jane is, who wouldn't be? She's fit to be tied. Pierce goes to the White House and is full-on depressed. So this, I think, explains Pierce couldn't get out of bed some days, and I think he otherwise might have been a reasonable president. What about this guy? Trump is unlike any president we've ever had. He has broken almost every precedent. We don't know what to make out of a president who makes fun of the disabled reporter, makes fun of Gold Star families, brags about molesting women, makes fun of POWs, made fun of an American hero, John McCain, posthumously. Of his thousands and thousands of tweets, over 50% of the tweets have been attacking American citizens. The president has some basic roles. If you look at Article 2 of the Constitution, you can basically discern a few roles. I always teach these as chief, so my students remember them. Commander-in-chief, obviously. CEO, chief executive of the federal government. Chief diplomat, he oversees our foreign policy, our employees, our UN relations. Chief legislator, the legislation starts with and usually ends with the president's signature. Things of that effect. Chief of state, the president invites the winning football team to the White House, the team that wins the Super Bowl. The president calls the Girl Scouts that win to sell the most cookies and wishes the country a happy birthday on the 4th of July. So chief of state. But there's also this role of preacher in chief. We look for a president to be a moral leader. Lincoln talked about our better angels. The president's job is to appeal to our better angels and lift us up, not tear us down and divide. A president should be optimistic. Reagan always felt that being an optimist and sort of what I always call cheerleader in chief, like a president of the Chamber of Commerce, an optimist who roots for the country, doesn't display imported products like the Goya things on his desk, celebrates America and Americans, is the president for all the people. FDR used to say that the presidency is first and foremost a moral office. So Trump is polarizing. It's going to be a difficult and controversial argument. I will say that if you look at some of the recent polling, they've asked historians where they would put Trump, and he's been dead last. So it's too early to rank. I think it's too early to rank Obama. It's too early to rank Trump. We've seen Obama anywhere from about 8 to about 14. It's too early to rank Trump. I will say I think he'll end up dead last, and I suspect I'll put him dead last. So let's end with this. What lessons can we discern from the greats versus the not so greats? Here you can see the greats tend to get elected by a greater margin victory rather than a nail biter. They have a regime, as I mentioned earlier. Think of FDR's domestic policy regime or Truman's foreign policy regime. For decades after them, the policies and approaches that they put in place are still there. George Washington had the greatest regime. The informal nuances of the presidency were followed by every single president, but the current one. So that's a heck of a regime. They tend to be taller, for whatever that means. I've said a lot of them are over 6 foot. They tend to come from wealthy families, a couple noted exceptions: Lincoln, Truman, Washington. They tend to be outgoing, but few very close attachments, friendly with everyone. Think of the Reagans and Bill Clinton type of thing, friendly with everybody, but few really close friends. They have great inaugural addresses. We always remember Lincoln's, FDR's, and Kennedy's, for example, is among the three greatest orations in American history. They're great rhetoricians and orators. Think of FDR as a date that will live. The original writing said history in infamy. So great wordsmiths. They have greater energy and activism. They've worked around the clock. Even some of the greats, when they go to their presidential retreats, they work all weekend and during the holidays. They tend to be intellectually curious and inquisitive, idealistic, empathetic, optimistic, creative, goal-oriented, self-disciplined. I'll leave you with this. I put together a list based on conversations with presidential historians over years, and also looking up those who make their list of the traits of the greats. So here you see the list that they tend to release. So based on my own work and interviewing countless historians, here's a list of 15 traits that I think define our great leaders. Their inaugural addresses are memorable. They're great rhetoricians. They can lay out a vision for the country. They're very energetic. They're intellectually curious. They're readers. They tend to be voracious readers who have a great command of history. They're intelligent. They're very smart. They're idealistic, but yet have a pragmatic side. They're optimists and they're very positive. Their message, their speeches are always trying to lift America up. They're very creative. They find unique and creative ways to solve problems. Truman wanted a Civil Rights Act. Southerners, conservatives blocked him. The Dixiecrats, Strom Thurmond, they thought that they had defeated him. Truman uses an executive order, as I said, 9981, to integrate the military, knowing that once we integrate the military, it'll only be a matter of time before this happens for society. And he uses Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation as his rationale. Truman uses the Marshall Plan. How does he justify it? Lincoln's Reconstruction. So they tend to be very creative, very goal-oriented. If you look at presidential promises versus those that realize those promises, they tend to have a few clearly defined goals and get them done. They're compromisers. Today, this has a bad connotation. It should never have a bad connotation. The framers knew that democracy depended on compromise, cooperation, and consensus. We shouldn't have these chest thumpers who say, I will never compromise. They compromise. They're very self-disciplined in terms of their workload and staying focused on their speeches, their goals, their agenda. They have great integrity, very ethical. They have great integrity and great honor. And lastly, they're risk takers. So they're willing to take the difficult risks to get the job done. Remember, FDR was not afraid to fail during the Great Depression. We oftentimes hear critics saying a lot of his programs in the New Deal did not work. And the answer is, you're right, they didn't work. But he was not afraid to fail. You know, he threw spaghetti on the wall like my grandmother and then saw which ones would stick, right? And he got rid of those that didn't work and embraced those that did work. So I encourage you to create your list of top 10, bottom 10. And that's how we rank the great presidents and the not so great presidents. Thank you for your time.